The four men sat silently, playing blackjack, under a green droplight in the dark morning. Only a voice whispered from the ceiling. 1:35 a.m., Thursday morning, October 4th, 2052 AD. 1:40 a.m., 1:50. Mr. Montag sat stiffly among the other firemen in the firehouse, heard the voice clock mourn out the cold hour and the cold year, and shivered. The other three glanced up. "What's wrong, Montag?" A radio hummed somewhere. "War may be declared at any hour. This country stands ready to defend its destiny and..." The firehouse trembled as 500 jet planes screamed across the black morning sky. The firemen slumped in their coal blue uniforms, with the look of 30 years in their blue-shaved, sharp, pink faces, and their burnt-colored hair. Stacked behind them were glittering piles of auxiliary helmets. Downstairs, in concrete dampness, the fire monster itself slept. The silent dragon of nickel and tangerine colors, the boa constrictor hoses, the twinkling brass. "I'm thinking of our last job," said Mr. Montag. "Don't," said Leshy, the fire chief. "That poor man, when we burnt his library. How would it feel if firemen burnt our houses and our books? We haven't any books. But if we did have some, you got some?" "No?" Montag gazed beyond them to the wall and the typed lists of 1,000,000 forbidden books. The titles cringed in fire, burning down the years under his axe and his fire hose, spraying not water, but kerosene. "Was it always like this?" asked Mr. Montag. "The firehouse, our duties, once upon a time." "Once upon a time?" Leshy crowed. "What kind of language is that?" "Fool!" Montag cried to himself. "You'll give yourself away. That last fire, a book of fairy tales." He had dared to read one line or so. He said quickly, "in the old days, before homes were completely fireproof. Didn't firemen ride to fires to put them out instead of start them?" "I never knew that." Stoneman and Black drew forth their rule books and laid them where Montag, thought long familiar with, might read. 1. Answer the alarm quickly. 2. Start the fire swiftly. 3. Make sure you burn everything. 4. Report back to the firehouse. 5. Stand alert for another alarm. Everyone watched Montag. He swallowed. What will they do to that old man we caught last night with his books? Insane asylum. But he wasn't insane. Any man who thinks he can hide books from the government or us. Leshy blew a great fierce cloud of cigarette smoke from his thin mouth. He idled back. The alarm sounded. The bell kicked itself 200 times in a few seconds. Suddenly, there were 3 empty chairs. The cards fell in a snow flurry. The brass pole trembled. The men were gone, their hats with them. Montag still sat. Below, the orange dragon coughed to life. Montag slid down the pole like a man in a dream. "Montag, you forgot your hat." He got it, and they were off. The night wind hammering about their siren noise, and their mighty metal thunder. It was a flaking 3-story house in the old section of town. a century old if it was a day. But, like every house, it had been given a thin, fireproof plastic coat 50 years ago. And this preservative shell seemed to be holding it up. Here we are. The engine slammed to a stop. Leshy, Stoneman, and Black ran up the sidewalk, suddenly odious and fat with their plump slickers. Montag followed. They crashed the front door and caught a woman running. "I didn't hurt anyone," she cried. "Where are they?" Leshy twisted her wrist. "You wouldn't take an old woman's pleasures from her, would you?" Stoneman produced the telephone alarm card, with the complaint signed in facsimile duplicate on the back. "Says here, Chief, the books are in the attic." "All right, men, let's get 'em." Next thing, they were up in musky blackness, swinging silver hatchets at doors that were, after all, unlocked, tumbling through like boys all rollick and shout. "Hey!" A fountain of books sprayed down on Montag as he climbed stuttering up the steep stairwell. Books bombarded his shoulders, his pale face. A book lit, almost obediently, like a white pigeon, in his hands, wings spluttering. In the dim, wavering light, a page hung open, and it was like a snowy feather, the words delicately painted thereon. In all the rush and fervor, Montag only had an instant to read a line, but it blazed in his mind for the next minute, as if stamped there with a fiery iron. He dropped the book immediately. Another fell in his arms. "Montag, get up." Montag's hand closed like a trap, crushed the book with wild devotion. With an insanity of mindlessness to his chest, the men above were hurling shovel fists of literature into the dusty air. They fell like slaughtered birds, and the woman stood like a small girl among the bodies. "Montag!" He climbed up into the attic. "This too shall pass away." "What?" Leshy glared at him. Montag froze, blinking. "Did I say something?" "Move, you idiot." The books lay in piles, like fishes left to dry. "Trash, trash!" The men danced on the books. Titles glittered their golden eyes, falling, gone. "Kerosene!" They pumped the cold fluid from the white snake they had twined upstairs. They coated every book. They pumped the room full of it. "This is better than the old man's place last night, eh?" That had not been much fun. The old man had lived in an apartment house with other people. They had to use controlled fire there. Here, they could ravage the entire house. They ran downstairs, Montag reeling after them in the kerosene fumes. "Come on, woman." "My books," she said quietly. She kneeled among them, to touch the drenched leather, to read the gilt titles with her fingers instead of her eyes, while her eyes accused Montag. "You can't take my books," she said. "You know the law," said Leshy. "Pure nonsense. All of it. No two books alike, none agreeing. Confusion. Stories about people who never existed. Come on now." "No," she said. "The whole house will burn. I won't go." The three men walked clumsily to the door. They glanced back at Montag, who stood near the woman. "You're not leaving her here," he protested. "She won't come." "But she's got to." Leshy raised his hand. It concealed a lighter to start the fire. "Got to get back to the station. Besides, she'll cost us a trial, money, jail." Montag placed his hand around the woman's elbow. You can come with me. No. She actually focused her eyes on him for a moment. Thank you. Anyways, I'm counting to 10, Leshy said. 1, 2. Please, Montag said. Go on, said the woman. 3, Leshy said. Come on, Montag pulled at her. I want to stay here, she replied quietly. 4, 5. The woman twisted. Montag slipped an oily book and fell. The woman ran up the stairs, halfway, and stood there with the books at her feet. 6, 7. Montag, Leshy said. Montag did not move. He looked out the door at the man there, with the pink face, pink and burnt and shiny from too many fires. Pink from night's excitements. The pink face of Mr. Leshy, with the lighter poised in his pink fingers. Montag felt the hidden book against his pounding chest. Go get him, Leshy ordered. The men dragged Montag, yelling from the house. Leshy backed out after them, leaving a kerosene trail down the walk. When they were 100 feet away, Montag was still shouting and kicking. He glanced wildly back. In the front door, where she had come to gaze out at them quietly, her quietness a condemnation. Staring straight into Leshy's eyes was the woman. Leshy twitched his finger to ignite the fuel. He was too late, Montag gasped. The woman in the door, reaching with contempt towards them all, struck a match against the saturated wood. And people ran out of their houses, all down the street. Who is it? Who would it be? Said Mr. Montag, leaning back against the closed door in the dark. His wife said at last, Well, put on the light. I don't want the light, he said. Come to bed. He heard her roll impatiently. The springs squeaked. Are you drunk? He worked out of his coat and let slump to the floor. He held his pants out into an abyss and let them fall forever and forever into darkness. His wife said, What are you doing? He bounced in space with the book in his wetting, icy hand. A minute later, she said, Well, don't stand there in the middle of the room. He made a small sound. What? She asked. He made more soft sounds. He stumbled towards the bed and shoved the book clumsily under the cold pillow. He fell into the bed, and his wife cried out, startled. He lay separate from her. She talked to him for what seemed a long while, and when he didn't reply, but only made sounds, he felt her hand creep over, up along his chest, his throat, his chin. Her hand brushed his cheek. He knew that she pulled her hand away from his cheek wet. A long time later, when he was finally floating into sleep, he heard her say, You smell of kerosene. I always smell kerosene, he mumbled. Late in the night, he looked over at Mildred. She was awake. There was a tiny dance of melody in the room. She had her thimble radio tapped into her ear, listening and listening to far people in far places. Her eyes peeled back wide at deep ceilings of blackness. Many nights in the last 10 years, he had found her with her eyes open like a dead woman. She would lie that way, blankly, hour upon hour, and then rise and go silently into the bath. You could hear faucet water run, the tinkle of the sedative bottle, and Mildred gulping hungrily, frantically, at sleep. She was awake now. In a moment, she would rise and go for the barbiturates. Mildred, he thought. And suddenly, she was so strange that he couldn't believe that he knew her at all. He was in someone else's house, like those jokes men told about the gentleman, drunk on life, who had come home late at night, unlocked the wrong door, entered a wrong room, and now here, Montague laid in the strange night by this unidentified body he had never seen before. "Millie," he called. "What?" "I didn't mean to startle you. What I want to know is, when did we meet? And where? For what? I mean, originally." She was frowning in the dark. He clarified it. "The first time we ever met, where was it? And when?" "Why, it was, at..." She stopped. "I don't know." He was frightened. "Can't you remember?" They both tried. It'd been so long. Only 10 years. We're both only 30. Don't get excited. I'm trying to think." She laughed a strange laugh. "How funny not to remember where or when you met your husband or wife." He lay with his eyes tight, pressing, massaging his brow. It was suddenly more important than any other thing in a lifetime that he knew where he had met Mildred. It doesn't matter. She was up, in the bathroom now. He heard the water rushing, the swallowing sound. "No, I guess not," he murmured. And he wondered, did she take 20 tablets now, like a year ago? When we had to pump her stomach, and me shouting to keep her awake, walking her, asking her why she did it, why she wanted to die, and she saying she didn't know. She didn't know. She didn't know anything about anything. She didn't belong to him. He didn't belong to her. She didn't know herself, him, or anyone. The world didn't need her. She didn't need herself. And in the hospital, he realized that if she died, he would not cry, for it was the dying of an unknown person, a street face, a face in the newspaper. And it was suddenly so wrong that he began to cry. Not at death, but at the thought of not crying at death. A silly, empty man beside an empty woman, while the doctors emptied her still more. And why are we empty, lonely, and not in love? He had asked himself years ago. They were never together. There was always something between. A radio, a television, a car, a plane, a game, nervous exhaustion, or simply a little phenobarbital. They didn't know each other. They knew things, inventions. They had applied science, while it had built a beautiful glass structure. A glittering miracle of contraptions about them. And, too late, they had found it to be a glass wall. They could not shout through the wall. They could only pantomime silence. Never touching, hearing, barely seeing each other. looking at Mildred at the hospital. He had thought, does it matter if we live or die? That might not have been enough if the people have not moved next door with their daughter. Perhaps that had been the start of his awareness of his job, his marriage, his life. One night, it was long ago, he had gone out for a long walk in the moonlight. He realized that he had come out from the nagging of his wife's television set. He walked, hands in pocket, blowing steam from his mouth into the cold air. Alone. He looked at the avenues ahead. By God, I'm alone. Not another pedestrian in miles. He walked swiftly down street after street. Why? I'm the only pedestrian in this entire city? The streets were empty and long and quiet. Distantly, on crosstown arteries, a few cars moved in the dark, but no other man ventured upon the earth to test the use of his legs. In fact, it had been so many years since the sidewalks were used that they were buckling, becoming obscured with grass. So he walked alone, aware of his loneliness, until the police car pulled up and flashed its cold white light upon him. "What are you doing?" shouted a voice. "I'm out for a walk." He says he's out for a walk. The laughter, the cold, precise turning over of his identity cards, the careful nodding of his address. "Okay, mister, you can walk now." He had gone on, stomping his feet, jerking his mouth, and hands, eyes blazing, gripping his elbows. The nerve, the nerve! Is there a law against pedestrians? The girl turned a corner and walked towards him. She stopped and glanced at him. "Why, hello," she said, and put out her hand. "You're my neighbor, aren't you?" "I am," he said. She was smiling quietly. "We're the only living ones, aren't we?" She waved at the empty sidewalks. "Did the police stop you too?" "Walking's a crime." "They flashed their lights on me, but saw I was a woman." She was no more than 16, Montag estimated, with eyes and hair as dark as mulberries, and a paleness about her that was not illness, but radiance. Then they drove away. "I'm Clarice McKellen, and you're Mr. Montag, the fireman." They walked together, and she began to talk for the both of them. "It's a graveyard, this town," she said. "I like to walk, to keep my franchise on the sidewalks." He looked, and it was true. The city was like a dark tomb. Every house deep in television dimness. Not a sound or move anywhere. "Have you ever noticed all the cars rushing?" she asked. "On the big boulevards, down the way, day and night. I sometimes think they don't know what grass is, or flowers, because they never see them slowly. If you shove them a green blur, 'Oh yes,' they say, 'that's grass.' A pink blur, 'Yes, that's roses.'" She laughed to herself. "A white blur is a house. Quick brown blurs are cows. My uncle drove slowly on a highway once. They threw him in jail." "Isn't that funny? And sad too?" "You think of a lot of things for a girl," said Montag uneasily. "That's because I've got time to think. I never watch TV. or go to games, or races, or fun parks. So I've lots of time for crazy thoughts, I guess. Have you seen the 200-foot-long billboards in the country? Well, did you know that billboards were once only 25 feet long? But cars started to go by so quickly, they had to stretch out the advertisement so it could be seen. I didn't know that. Montag laughed abruptly. But I know something else you don't. What? There's dew on the grass in the morning. He couldn't remember, and suddenly it frightened him. And if you look, there's a man in the moon. He had never looked. His heart beat rapidly. They walked the rest of the way in silence. When they reached her house, its lights were blazing. It was the only house in a city of 1,000,000 houses, with its lights burning brightly. What's going on? Montag had never seen that many house lights. Oh, just my mother and father and uncle, sitting around, talking. It's like being a pedestrian, only rarer. But what do they talk about? She laughed at this, said goodnight, and was gone. At 3 in the cold morning, he got out of bed and stuck his head out the front window. The moon was rising, and there was a man in the moon. Over the broad lawn, 1,000,000 jewels of dew sparkled. I'll be damned, Montag said, and went back to bed. He saw Clarice many afternoons, and came to hope he would be seeing her, found himself watching for her, sitting on her green lawn, studying the autumn leaves with a fine casual air, or returning from a distant woods with wild yellow flowers, or looking at the sky, even while it was raining. Isn't rain nice? She said. I hadn't noticed. Believe me, it is nice. He always laughed, embarrassingly, or at her, or at himself. He wasn't sure. I believe you. Do you really? Did you ever smell old leaves? Don't they smell like cinnamon? Here. Why, it is cinnamon, yes. She gazed at him with her clear, dark eyes. My gosh, you don't really know very much, do you? She was not unkind, just concerned for him. I don't suppose any of us know very much. I do, she said quietly, because I've time to look. Don't you attend school? Oh no, they say I'm antisocial. I don't mix. And the yelling bullying is the thing among kids this season. You know? It's been a long season, observed Montag, and stood somewhat shocked at his own perception. Then you noticed. Yes, but what about your friends? I haven't any. That's supposed to prove I'm at normal. But they're always packed around the TV, or racing in cars, or shouting, or beating one another. Do you notice how people hurt one another nowadays? You sound ancient. I am. I know about rain. That makes me ancient to them. They kill each other. It didn't used to be that way, did it? Children killing each other all the time? 4 of my friends have been shot the past year. I'm afraid of children. Maybe it was always this way. My father says his grandfather remembered when children didn't kill each other, when children were seen. and not heard. But that was a long time ago, when they had discipline and responsibility. Do you know? I'm disciplined. I'm spanked when I need it, and I've responsibility. I do all the shopping and house cleaning by hand. And you know about the rain, said Mr. Montague, with the rain beating on his hat and coat. It tastes good if you lean back and open your mouth. Go on. He leaned back and gasped. Why, he said, it's wine. That had not been the end of it. The girl talked to him one bright afternoon and given him the dandelion test. It proves you're in love or not. She brushed a dandelion under his chin. What a shame. You're not in love with anyone. And he thought, when did I stop loving Mildred? And the answer was never, for he had never known her. She was the pale, sad goldfish that swam in the subterranean illumination of the television parlor, her natural habitat. It's dandelion you used, protested Montague. No, said Clarice solemnly. You're not in love. A dandelion won't help. She tossed the flower away. Well, I've got to go see my psychiatrist. My teachers are sending me to him. He's trying to make me normal. I'll throttle him if he does. Right now, he's trying to figure out why I go away from the city and walk in the forest once a day. Have you ever walked in a forest? No. It's so quiet and lovely, and nobody rushing. I like to watch the birds and the insects. They don't rush. Before she left him to go inside, she looked at him suddenly and said, Do you know, Mr. Montague? I can't believe you're a fireman. Why not? Because you're so nice. Do you mind if I ask one last question? I don't mind. Why do you do what you do? Before he knew what she meant or could make a reply, she had run off, embarrassed at her own frankness. What did she mean? Why do I do what I do? He said to himself, I'm a fireman, of course. I burn books. Is that what she meant? He didn't see Clarice for a month. He watched for her every day, but made no point of her absence to his wife. He wanted to go rap on the parents' door, but decided against it. He didn't want them misunderstanding his interest in the child. But after 36 days had passed, he brought Clarice's name offhand. Oh, her, said Mildred, with the radio music jarring the table plates. Why, didn't you know? Know what? She was killed by an automobile a month ago. A month? But why didn't anyone tell me? Didn't I? I suppose it slipped my mind. Yes, a car did hit her. Did they find whose car it was? No, you know how those things are. What do you want for supper? Frozen steak or chops? And so, Clarice was dead. No, disappeared. For in a large city, you didn't die. You simply vanished. No one missed you. No one saw you go. Your death was as insignificant as that of a butterfly carried secretly away, caught in the radiator grill of a speeding car. And with Clarice's death, half the world was dead, and the other half was instantly revealed to him for what it was. He saw what Mildred was, and what always would be. What he himself was, but didn't want to be anymore. And he saw that it was no idle thing. Mildred's suicide attempts, The lovely dark girl, with the flowers being ground under a car. It was a thing of the world they lived in. It was a part of the screaming, pressing down of the people into electric molds. It was the meaningless flight of civilians down a rotary track to smash its own senseless trail. Mildred's flight was trying to die and escape nothingness, whereas Clarice had been fighting nothingness with something, with being aware instead of forgetting, with walking instead of sitting, with going to get life instead of having it brought to her. And this civilization had killed her for her trouble, not purposefully, no, but with a fine ironic sense, for no purpose at all. Killed by a vanilla-faced idiot, racing nowhere, for nothing, and irritated that he had been detained 120 seconds while the police investigated and released him on his way to some distant base, which he must tag frantically before running for home. Montag felt the slow gathering of his awareness. Mildred, Clarice, the fireman, the murdering children. Last night, the old man's books burned and him in an asylum. Tonight, that woman burned before his eyes. It was such a nightmare that only another nightmare, less horrible, could be used to escape from it. And Clarice had died weeks ago. And he had not seen her die, which made it somehow crueler, and yet more bearable. Clarice. Montag lay all night long, thinking, smelling the smoke on his hands in the dark. He had chills and fever in the morning. "You can't be sick," said Mildred. He closed his eyes upon the hotness. "Yes." "But you were all right last night." "No, I wasn't all right." He heard the radio in the parlor. Mildred stood over his bed, curiously. He had felt her there. He saw her without opening his eyes, her hair burnt by chemicals to a brittle straw. Her eyes with a kind of mental cataract, unseen, but suspect, far behind the pupils. The reddened, pouting lips, the body as thin as a praying mantis from dieting, and her flesh like raw milk. He could remember her no other way. "Will you bring me an analgesia and water?" "You got to get up," she said. "It's noon. You slept for 5 hours later than usual." "Will you turn the radio off?" he asked. "It's my favorite program." "Will you turn it off for a sick man?" "I'll turn it down." She went out of the room and did nothing to the radio, and came back. "Is that better?" "Thanks." "That's my favorite program," she repeated, as if she had not said that 1,000 times before. "What about the analgesic?" "You've never been sick before." She went away again. "Well, I'm sick now. I'm not going to work tonight. Call Leshy for me." "You acted funny last night," she returned, humming. "Where's the analgesic?" He glanced at the water glass. "Oh." She walked to the bath again. "Did something happen?" "A fire. That's all." "I had a nice evening," she said in the bathroom. What doing? Television. What was on? Programs. What programs? Some of the best ever. Who? Oh, you know, the big TV shows. Yes, the big TV shows. Big, big, big. He pressed at the pain in his eyes, and suddenly the odor of kerosene made him vomit. Mildred came in, humming. She was surprised. Why'd you do that? He looked with dismay at the floor. We burnt an old woman with her books. It's a good thing that the rug's washable. She fetched a mop and swabbed clumsily at it. I went to Helen's last night. Couldn't you get the shows on your own TV? Sure, but it's nice visiting. Did Helen get over that finger infection? I didn't notice. She went out into the living room. He heard her by the radio singing. Mildred, he called. She returned, singing, snapping at her fingers softly. Aren't you going to ask me about last night? He asked. What about it? We burnt 1,000 books and a woman. Forbidden books. The radio was exploding in the parlor. Yes, copies of Plato and Socrates and Marcus Aurelius. Foreigners? Something like that. Then they were radicals. All foreigners can't be radicals. If they wrote books, they were. Mildred fiddled with the phone. You don't expect me to call Mr. Leshy, do you? You must. Don't shout. I wasn't shouting. He was up in bed, suddenly, enraged and flushed, shaking. The radio roared in the hot air. I can't call him. I can't tell him I'm sick. Why? Because you're afraid, he thought, pretending illness, afraid to call Leshy. Because after a moment's discussion, the conversation would run so. Yes, Mr. Leshy, I feel better already. I'll be in at 10 o'clock tonight. You're not sick, said Mildred. Montague fell back in bed. He reached under his pillow and groped for the hidden book. It was still there. Mildred, how would it be if, well, maybe I quit my job for a while. You want to give up everything? After all these years of working? Because one night, some woman and her books? You should have seen her, Millie. She's nothing to me. She shouldn't have books. It was her responsibility. She should have thought about that. I hate her. She's got you going, and next thing you know, we'll be out. No house, no job, nothing. You weren't there. You didn't see, he said. There must be something in books. Whole worlds we don't dream about. To make a woman stay in a burning house. There must be something fine there. You don't stay and burn for nothing. She was simple-minded. She was as rational as you or I. More so, and we burnt her. That's water under the bridge. No, not water, Millie, but fire. You ever seen a house burn down? It smolders for days. Well, this fire will last me half a century. My God, I've been trying to put it out in my mind all night, and I'm crazy with trying. You should have thought about that before becoming a fireman. Thought? He said. Was I given a choice? Was I raised to think the best thing in the world is not to read? The best thing is television and radio and ball games and a home I can't afford and, good Lord, only now I realize what I've done. My grandfather and father were firemen. Walking in my sleep, I followed them. The radio was playing a dance tune. I've been killing the brain of the world for 10 years, pouring kerosene on it. Millie, a book is a brain. It isn't only that woman we destroyed, or others like her. In these years, it's the thoughts I burnt and never knew it. He got out of bed. It took some man a lifetime to put some of his thoughts on paper, looking after all the beauty and goodness in life. And then we come along in 2 minutes and heave it in the incinerator. Let me alone, said Mildred. Let you alone? He almost cried out with laughter. Letting you alone is easy. How can I leave myself alone? That's what's wrong. We need not to be left alone. We need to be upset and stirred and bothered once in a while. Anyways, nobody bothers anyone anymore. Nobody thinks. Let a baby alone. Why don't you? What would you have in 20 years? A savage, unable to think or talk like us. Mildred glanced out the window. Now you've done it. Look who's here. I don't give a damn, he said, feeling better, but didn't know why. It's Mr. Leshy. The elation drained away. Montague slumped. Go. Open the door, he said at last. Tell him I'm sick. Tell him yourself. He made sure the book was hidden behind the pillow, climbed back into bed, and had made himself trembling uncomfortably when the door opened and Mr. Leshy strolled in, hands in pockets. Shut the radio off, said Leshy abstractedly. This time, Mildred obeyed. Mr. Leshy sat down in the comfortable chair with a look of strange peace in his pink face. He did not look at Montague. Just thought I'd come by and see how the sick man is. How do you guess? Oh. Leshy smiled, his pink smile, and shrugged. I'm an old hand at this. I've seen it all. You were going to call me and tell me you needed a day off. Yes. Well, take a day off, said Mr. Leshy, looking at his hands. He carried an eternal match with him at all times, in a little case which said, Guaranteed, 1,000,000 cigarettes can be lit with this match, and kept striking this abstractedly against its case as he talked. Take a day off. Take 2, but never take 3. He struck the match and looked at the flame and blew it out. When will you be well? Tomorrow. The next day. First of the week. We've been wondering about you. Leshy put a cigarette in his mouth. Every fireman goes through this. They only need to understand, need to know how the wheels run, what the history of our profession is. They don't give it to rookies anymore. Only fire chiefs remember it now. I'll let you in on it. He lit a cigarette leisurely. Mildred fidgeted. You ask yourself about the burning of books. Why? How? When? Leshy exuded a great gray cloud of smoke. Maybe, said Montague. It started around about the Civil War, I'd say. Photography discovered. fast printing, presses coming up, films at the early past of the 20th century, radio, television, things began to have mass. Montag, mass. I see. And because they had mass, they became simpler. Books, now. Once they appealed to various small groups of people, here, there, they could afford to be different. The world was roomy. But then the world got full of mass and elbows. Films and radios and magazines and books had to level down to a sort of paste-puddling norm. Do you follow me? I think so. Leshy looked through a veil of smoke, not at Montag, but at the thing he was describing. Picture it. 19th century, man with his horses, dog, and slow living. You might call him a slow-motion man. Then, in the 20th century, you speed up the camera. A good analogy. Splendid. Books get shorter, condensed, appear, digest, tabloids, radio programs simplified. Everything sublimes itself into the gag, the snap ending. Snap ending, Mildred nodded approvingly. You should have heard last night. Great classics are cut to fit 15-minute shows. Then 2-minute book columns. Then 2 lines digest resumes. Magazines become picture books. Out of the nursery to the college. Back to the nursery in a few short centuries. Mildred rose. She was losing the thread of the talk, Montag knew. And when this happened, she began to fiddle with things. She went about the room, picking up. Faster and faster, the film, Mr. Montag. Quick, click, pick, look, eyes, now, flick, flash, here, there, swift, up, down, why, who, when, Mr. Montag. Digest. Political affairs in one column, a sentence, a headline, and then, in midair, vanish. The mind of man, whirling so fast under the pumping hands of publishers, publicists, ad men, broadcasters, that the centrifuge throws off all ideas. He is unable to concentrate. Mildred was smoothing the bed now. Montag felt panic as she approached his pillow to straighten it. In a moment, with sublime innocence, she would be pulling out the hidden book out from behind the pillow and displaying it as if it were a reptile. Leshy blew a cumulus of cigarette smoke at the ceiling. School is shortened, discipline relaxed, philosophies, history, languages dropped, English and spelling neglected, finally ignored. Life is immediate, the job counts. Why learn anything save pressing buttons, pulling switches, fitting bolts? Let me fix your pillow, said Mildred, being the video housewife. No, whispered Montag. The zipper replaces the button. Does a man have time to think while dressing in the morning? A philosophical time? No, said Montag automatically. Mildred tugged at the pillow. Get away, said Montag. Life becomes one big pratfall, Mr. Montag. No subtleties. Everything is bang and boof and wow. Wow, reflected Mildred, yanking the pillow's edge. For God's sake, let me be, cried Montag passionately. Leshy stared. Mildred's hand was frozen behind the pillow. Her hand was on the book. Her face stunned, her mouth opening to ask a question. Theaters stand empty, Mr. Montag, replaced by the television. And baseball. And sports, where no one has to think at all. Not at all. Now Leshy was almost invisible. A voice somewhere, back of a choking screen of cigar smoke. What's this? Asked Mildred with delight. Almost. Montag crushed and heaved against her hand. What have you hid there? Sit down, Montag screamed. She jumped back, her hands empty. We're talking. Leshy continued, mildly. Cartoons everywhere. Books behind some cartoons. The mind drinks less and less. Impatience. Time to kill. No work at all. All leisure. Highways full of crowds going somewhere, anywhere, nowhere. The gasoline refuge. Towns becoming motels. People in nomadic surges from the city to city. Impatience. Following the moontides. Living tonight in a room where you slept last night, and I the night before. Mildred went into the other room and slammed the door. Go on, said Montague. Intelligent writers gave up in disgust. Magazines were vanilla tapioca. The book buyer, bored by the dishwater, his brain spinning, quit buying. Everyone but the comic publisher died a slow publishing death. There you have it. Don't blame the government, technology, mass exploitation, and censorship from frightened officials. Did the trick. Today, thanks to them, you can read comics, confessions, or trade journals. Nothing else. All the rest is dangerous. Yes, but why Fireman? Asked Montague. Ah, said Leshy, leaning forward in a cloud of smoke to finish. With schools turning out doers instead of thinkers, with non-readers, naturally, in ignorance, they hated and feared books. You always fear an unfamiliar thing. Intellectual became a swear word. Books were snobbish things. The little man wants you and me to be like him, not everyone born free and equal, as the Constitution says, but everyone made equal. A book is a loaded gun. In the house next door, burn it. Take the shot out of the weapon. Unbreach man's mind. Who knows who might be the target of the well-read man? And so, when houses became all fireproof, and there was no longer need of firemen for protection, they were given the new job as official censors, judges, jurors, punishers. That's you, Mr. Montague. And me. Leshy stood up. I got to get going. Montague lay back in bed. Thanks for explaining it to me. You must understand our civilization is so vast that we can't have our minorities upset and stirred. People must be content. Books bother them. Colored people don't like Little Black Sambo. We burn it. White people don't like Uncle Tom's Cabin. Burn it, too. Anything for serenity. Leshy shook Montague's limp hand. Oh, one last thing. Once in his career, every fireman gets curious. What do the books say? He wonders. A good question. Well, they say nothing, Mr. Montague. Nothing you can touch or believe in. They're about non-existent people, figments, not to be trusted. But anyways, say a fireman takes a book at a fire, almost by accident. A natural error. Natural? We allow that. We let him keep it 24 hours. If he hasn't burnt it, we'll burn it for him. I see, said Montague. His throat was dry. You'll be at work tonight at 6 o'clock? No. What? Montague shut his eyes. I'll be in later. Maybe. See that you do. I'll never come again, yelled Montague, but only in his mind. Get well. Leshy, trailing smoke, went out. Montague watched through the front window as Leshy drove away in his gleaming Beetle, which was the color of the last fire they had set. Mildred had turned on the afternoon television show and was staring into the shadow screen. Montague cleared his throat, but she didn't look up. It's only a step, he said, from not working today to not working tomorrow to not working ever again. You're going to work tonight, though. I'm doing more than that, he said. I'm going to start to kill people and rave and buy books. A one-man revolution, Mildred said lightly, turning to look at him. They'd put you in jail, wouldn't they? That's not a bad idea. The best people are there. He put his clothes on, furiously walking about the bedroom. But I'd kill a few people before I get locked up. There's a real bastard, that Leshy. You hear him? Knows all the answers, but does nothing about it. I won't listen at all to this junk, said Mildred. No? This is your house as well as mine, isn't it? Yes. Then I have something I want you to see. Something I put away and never looked at again during the past year. Not even knowing why I put them away and hid them and kept them and never told you. He dragged a chair into the hall, climbed up it, and opened an air vent. Reaching up, he began throwing books. Big ones, little ones, red, yellow, green books, 20, 30, 50 books, one by one, swiftly into the parlor at her feet. There. Leonard Montague, you didn't. So, you're not in this with me? You're in it up to your neck. She backed away, as if she were surrounded by a pack of terrible rats. Her face was paled out, and her eyes were fastened wide. And the breathing, as if someone had struck her in the stomach. They'll burn our house down. They'll kill us. Let them try. She hesitated. Then, moaning, she seized the book and ran towards the fireplace. He caught her. No, Millie. No. Never touch my books. Never. Or, by God, if you do, touch one of them, meaning to burn it, believe me, Millie, I'll kill you. Leonard Montague, you wouldn't. He shook her. Listen, he pleaded down into her face. He held her shoulders firmly, while her face bobbed helplessly, and tears sprang from her eyes. You must help me, he said slowly, trying to find his way into her thinking. You're in this now, whether you like it or not. I never asked for anything in my life of you. I ask it now. I plead it. We must start somewhere. We're going to read books. It's a thing we haven't done and must do. We've got to know what these books are so we can tell others, and so that, eventually, they can tell everyone. Sit down, Millie. There. Right there. I'll help you. We'll help each other. Between us, we'll do something. Destroy men like Leshy, and Stoneman, and Black, and myself, and this world we live in, and put it all back together, a different way. Do you hear me? Yes, her body sagged. The doorbell rang. They jerked about to stare at the door, and the books toppled everywhere. Everywhere, in heaps. Leshy. It can't be him. He's come back, sobbed Mildred. The bell rang again. Let him stand there. We won't answer. Montague reached blindly for a book on the floor. Any book. Any beginning. Any start. Any beauty at all would do. He put the book into Mildred's shaking hands. The bell rang a third time, insistently. Read. He quivered a hand to a page. Out loud. Mildred's eyes were on the door, and the bell rang angrily, loudly, again and again. He'll come in, she said. Oh God, and set fire to everything, and us. But at last she found the line, and Montague standing over her, swaying any line in the book. And after trying to find it 4 times, she began to fumble out the words of a poem printed on the white, unburnt paper. And evening vanished, and no more. The low, pale light across the land, the bell rang, nor now the long sea, nor now the long light at the sea. And here, face downward in the sun, another rang. Montag whispered, "You'll go away in a minute." Mildred's lips trembled. To feel how swift, how secretly the shadow of the night comes on. Near the ceiling, smoke from Leshy's cigar still lingered. The Fireman by Ray Bradbury. Part 1. Fire, Fire, Burn Books. Read with the voice of Eliot Rite.